There are crimes so brutal that even seasoned detectives never forget them. Cases that sit buried in dusty evidence boxes for years, waiting for one tiny crack to expose the truth. And sometimes, the person everyone fears might be guilty manages to walk free, hiding behind lies and carefully crafted alibis while a family waits endlessly for answers. But in this case, the truth refused to stay buried. Because the woman at the center of this mystery trusted the wrong person. And the man responsible had already done something horrifying before. Yet no one imagined just how far greed and betrayal would go. Before we uncover this chilling case, make sure you like this video, subscribe to Cold Case 247, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. On what seemed like an ordinary Sunday morning, nobody had any reason to believe that anything terrible had happened. The day began like any other. People were waking up, making coffee, and preparing for another routine day. But inside one quiet home in Washington state, an answering machine continued blinking. At 8:36 in the morning, Cheryl Petrie's coworker, Marcella, left a message. She sounded casual. Nothing in her voice suggested panic. She simply wondered if Cheryl had forgotten that she was supposed to open the store that day. A few minutes later, another message came in. This one from Betsy. It was 9 o'clock. Betsy had arrived at work and was waiting. She politely asked Cheryl to come as soon as possible. Still, nobody thought much of it. Cheryl was responsible and dependable. Maybe she had overslept. Maybe she had gotten caught up with something unexpected. Nobody imagined that those messages would become some of the last attempts anyone would make to reach her. As the hours passed, concern slowly began replacing confusion. Friends started asking questions. Something wasn't right. Cheryl had habits. She had routines. And disappearing without telling anyone wasn't one of them. As the sun began setting, her ex-husband, Roland Petrie, contacted authorities. He explained that Cheryl had failed to pick up their children after his weekend visitation. That alone was enough to alarm everyone who knew her. Police were dispatched to Cheryl's residence. Inside, they found nothing unusual. No signs of forced entry. No signs of struggle. No broken furniture. No indication that violence had occurred. But something immediately caught the attention of investigators. The answering machine. Its light continued blinking. Several messages had been left throughout the day. One message in particular stood out. It wasn't from a friend. It wasn't from family. And it wasn't from work. It was from a man calling from Seattle. He claimed he had found Cheryl's wallet floating in Lake Union. Investigators exchanged uneasy looks. Seattle was roughly an hour away across Puget Sound. According to everyone close to Cheryl, she had no connections there. No family. No friends. No business. No reason to travel there. The message raised far more questions than answers. How had her wallet ended up in Seattle? Why was it found in the water? And more importantly, where was Cheryl? Detectives knew they had very little time. If she was still alive, every passing hour mattered. The investigation quickly focused on those closest to her. And naturally, one name stood out. Roland Petrie. Her ex-husband. Investigators began digging into his background. What they uncovered shocked them. Roland wasn't unfamiliar with law enforcement. Years earlier, he had been involved in a murder-for-hire scheme connected to a case in Washington's San Juan Islands. Detectives couldn't ignore that fact. A man with that kind of history automatically deserved a closer look. Police brought him in for questioning. Roland appeared calm. Collected. Almost too calm. Detectives asked about the last time he had spoken with Cheryl. They wanted to know his movements during the previous days. Where had he been? Who had seen him? Could anyone verify his story? Roland had answers ready. He explained that he spent most of the weekend in Port Orchard. He provided receipts, witnesses, times, locations, everything investigators needed to verify his claims. And unfortunately for detectives, his story appeared to check out. But while officers looked into Roland's alibi, another team focused on Seattle. Lake Union had become the center of attention. After all, Cheryl's wallet had surfaced there. Maybe Cheryl herself had somehow ended up in the water. Seattle police divers entered the lake. They searched carefully. Hour after hour. Nothing. No body. No evidence. No clues. It was as though Cheryl had simply vanished. Days passed. The fear grew worse. Family members clung desperately to hope. Friends prayed for good news. But detectives were preparing themselves for a much darker outcome. 4 days into the investigation, officers made a discovery that changed everything. Cheryl's car had been found. It was parked roughly half a mile away from the lake. Investigators immediately secured the scene. Their hearts sank. Something about the vehicle felt wrong. As crime scene technicians processed the car, one detective decided to open the trunk. What he saw would haunt him forever. Inside was Cheryl Petrie. Her body had been stuffed into the trunk of her own car. Her arms were bound behind her back. Several books had been placed over her face. For a moment, investigators stood frozen. Even experienced detectives were shaken. When they carefully removed the books, they discovered why someone had placed them there. Cheryl had suffered one of the most savage beatings any of them had ever witnessed. Her injuries were horrific. The violence had been extreme. The anger behind the attack was obvious. Blood covered the inside of the trunk. Patterns of blood spatter revealed a horrifying truth. Cheryl had still been alive when she was placed inside. She had been trapped. Unable to escape. Unable to defend herself. And while lying helpless inside that cramped trunk, she had been beaten to death. The scene was almost impossible to comprehend. Detectives had witnessed many crimes. But few had ever encountered such brutality. At the medical examiner's office, specialists searched desperately for evidence. DNA. Fibers. Anything. Surprisingly, they found very little. There was no indication of sexual assault. No semen. No obvious clues pointing to a stranger. The killer had left almost nothing behind. But one detail continued bothering investigators. Those books. Why cover her face? It seemed strange. But experienced homicide detectives knew that this detail often carried meaning. Many killers who know their victims experience guilt. Not enough guilt to stop themselves from committing murder. But enough that they cannot bear to look at the face of the person they've destroyed. So they cover it. It's almost symbolic. As though hiding the victim somehow hides the reality of what they've done. The book suggested something important. Cheryl had probably known her killer. That realization brought investigators right back to Roland Petrie. The suspicion surrounding him only intensified. As detectives continued digging into Cheryl's life, they learned more about her relationship with her ex-husband. Friends described Cheryl as fiercely loyal. Perhaps too loyal. Years earlier, when Roland found himself imprisoned over another murder-related case, Cheryl stood beside him. Many people would have walked away. Not Cheryl. She believed in him. She defended him. She fought for him. She wrote letters. She contacted lawmakers. She appealed to parole boards. She dedicated herself to proving that he deserved another chance. Friends remembered how much energy she poured into helping him. She believed he had been treated unfairly. She loved him deeply. And despite warnings from people around her, Cheryl remarried him. She truly believed things would be different. But reality turned out much differently. The moment Roland regained his freedom, everything changed. Instead of gratitude, Cheryl received betrayal. He left her. Another woman had entered the picture. Once again, Cheryl found herself heartbroken. And once again, she filed for divorce. People close to her couldn't understand it. After everything she had sacrificed for him, Roland simply walked away. Still, Cheryl focused on raising her children and rebuilding her life. But there was something strange happening behind the scenes. Something few people fully understood at the time. And that strange decision would eventually become one of the most disturbing pieces of the entire investigation. Because only months before Cheryl disappeared, Roland convinced her to sign papers that would place a price on her life. And according to those closest to Cheryl, he had a very convincing story. A story involving illness. A story involving death. And a lie so calculated that even those who loved Cheryl couldn't believe she had fallen for it. But she did. And by the time everyone realized the truth, it was already too late. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who is truly following this shocking story. And if you're enjoying these true crime documentaries, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case 247. Because what detectives would discover next would reveal a scheme far darker than anyone had imagined. And it would take more than a decade before the truth finally emerged. Friends and relatives would later say that looking back, the warning signs had been there all along. But at the time, nobody imagined they were watching a deadly plan unfold. Roland Petrie had approached Cheryl with what sounded like heartbreaking news. According to him, he was dying. He claimed that exposure to Agent Orange had left him seriously ill and that doctors expected he had only a limited amount of time left to live. He spoke about the children. He spoke about their future. He talked about making sure they would be financially secure after he was gone. To Cheryl, it sounded like a father trying to do the right thing. He wanted life insurance. And naturally, Cheryl agreed. No matter what had happened between them, they still shared children together. She wanted to make sure they would be cared for. But according to investigators, Roland wasn't finished. He allegedly told Cheryl that having insurance only on him might raise questions with the insurance company. To avoid suspicion, he suggested taking out a policy on her as well. It seemed harmless. After all, they were both parents. Both wanted to protect their children. And Cheryl agreed. Those closest to her thought the arrangement was strange. Some openly questioned it. Others urged her to be careful. But Cheryl trusted him. She believed what he had told her. And for several months, life continued. Except something strange happened. Roland wasn't getting worse. He wasn't growing weaker. He wasn't dying. He seemed perfectly healthy. Friends noticed. Family members noticed. People began asking questions. The timeline simply didn't add up. And then, before anyone could understand what was really happening, Cheryl disappeared. Now detectives had a possible motive. Money. Insurance money. But proving motive and proving murder were two very different things. Investigators needed opportunity. And that was where things became frustrating. Based on witness statements and receipts, Roland appeared to have been alone for only a short period during the time Cheryl vanished. Detectives estimated he had roughly 2 hours. Enough time to commit murder. But not enough time to transport Cheryl's car all the way to Seattle, dump evidence, and somehow make it back unnoticed. Something didn't fit. If Roland had been involved, he couldn't have acted alone. But there was no evidence pointing to another person. No eyewitnesses. No fingerprints. No DNA. Nothing. Despite their suspicions, detectives were forced to admit the truth. They didn't have enough. Without new evidence, the investigation slowed. Weeks became months. Months became years. Eventually, Cheryl Petrie's file was placed among countless unsolved cases. Another victim waiting for answers. Another family forced to live with uncertainty. And another killer walking free. For 13 long years, Cheryl's murder remained a mystery. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. Her children grew older. And somewhere out there, the person responsible continued living life. But the pain never disappeared. Especially for Cheryl's daughter, Yvonne. As a child, she had lost her mother. And as she grew older, she found herself haunted by questions. Questions nobody could answer. Questions that refused to go away. Had her father really murdered her mother? Or had investigators been wrong all along? By the summer of 2001, Yvonne was 23 years old. And she desperately wanted the truth. Meanwhile, inside the Seattle Police Department, two cold case detectives were taking another look at old files. Detective Dick Gagnon and Detective Greg Mikesell had seen enough unsolved murders to know that cases often speak differently with time. Old evidence takes on new meaning. People change. Witnesses become willing to talk. Secrets become harder to carry. And sometimes, all it takes is one person with a guilty conscience. The detectives opened Cheryl Petrie's file. Inside were photographs, reports, interview transcripts, and memories frozen in time. Among the crime scene pictures was one image that still disturbed investigators. The books covering Cheryl's face. It had always seemed deeply personal. The detectives studied every detail. Every note. Every witness statement. The motive still appeared obvious. Money. Insurance. And one man who had spent his life looking for shortcuts. Friends described Roland as someone who constantly searched for ways to make easy money. Why work when you could manipulate others? Why earn when you could profit through lies? But suspicion alone wasn't enough. Then something unexpected happened. A phone call changed everything. One of Roland Petrie's former cellmates contacted authorities. The man had information. Information that had allegedly come directly from conversations inside prison. According to the informant, Roland had not killed Cheryl himself. Instead, he had hired someone else. Another inmate. A man named Fred McKee. Known by friends as Skip. The tip immediately caught investigators' attention. Because it explained something that had bothered detectives for years. How had Cheryl's car reached Seattle? How had everything happened within such a narrow timeline? A second person made perfect sense. But could the information be trusted? Prison informants were often unreliable. Some lied for favors. Some exaggerated stories. Others simply wanted attention. Still, detectives couldn't ignore the possibility. They decided to investigate. Their search led them to McNeil Island Correctional Center. That was where Fred "Skip" McKee was serving time. Detectives arranged an interview. When they first sat down with him, they noticed something immediately. Fear. Not anger. Not confidence. Fear. The man appeared nervous. Uncomfortable. As though the ghosts of the past had suddenly returned. Detectives sensed that he knew more than he was willing to admit. But despite their efforts, Fred McKee refused to cooperate. He said nothing. Not a word. No confession. No denial. Nothing. The interview ended in frustration. Still, detectives believed they were getting close. If the informant was telling the truth, then there was one person who knew exactly what had happened. Roland Petrie. By then, Roland was already behind bars. He was serving a 30-year sentence for an unrelated kidnapping conviction. Once again, violence had become part of his life. Detectives arranged to speak with him. They hoped years in prison might have softened him. Perhaps guilt had finally caught up with him. Perhaps he wanted to tell the truth. Instead, they met the same cold personality investigators remembered. Roland refused to cooperate. He shut down the interview almost immediately. He had nothing to say. Nothing to explain. Nothing to confess. The detectives left empty-handed. But experienced investigators knew something important. Sometimes people don't confess during interviews. Sometimes they confess afterward. Sometimes they need time. Time to think. Time to worry. Time to imagine what investigators already know. And that's exactly what happened. 2 weeks later, the phone rang. Roland Petrie wanted to talk. Detectives were stunned. After years of silence, he was suddenly willing to speak. What changed? Nobody knew. But detectives weren't about to miss the opportunity. They returned to prison. And this time, Roland began talking. He spoke about Fred McKee. He called him Skip. And slowly, piece by piece, the horrifying truth began emerging. According to Roland, he had convinced McKee that Cheryl was trying to take away his children. He manipulated him. He fueled anger. And eventually, he proposed murder. The plan was simple. Skip would wait inside Cheryl's house. Roland had provided him with keys. When Cheryl came home from work, Skip would already be there. And for carrying out the murder, McKee would receive thousands of dollars. $5,000. A life reduced to money. The confession stunned investigators. After 13 years, the truth had finally surfaced. But even now, there were details that remained almost impossible to comprehend. Because what happened inside Cheryl's home that day would reveal just how brutal and personal the murder had really been. And for Cheryl's daughter, the nightmare was only beginning. Because she was about to learn something so painful that it would leave wounds far deeper than losing her mother. She was about to discover that the man she called father had not only arranged her mother's murder. According to investigators, there had once been plans involving her too. And when that truth finally emerged, it would lead to one of the most emotional courtroom moments anyone present would ever witness. If you're still watching, drop a comment with "Justice always catches up." And if you're enjoying these true crime stories, be sure to like the video and subscribe to Cold Case 247. Because after 13 years of silence, the reckoning had finally arrived. For more than 13 years, Cheryl Petrie's family had lived with unanswered questions. There had been sleepless nights. Birthdays celebrated with an empty seat. Holidays that no longer felt complete. And every time someone mentioned Cheryl's name, they were reminded that her story had never truly ended. There had been no justice. No closure. Only pain. But now, after more than a decade of silence, detectives finally had what they had been searching for. A confession. The man they had suspected from the beginning had finally admitted his role. And with that confession came criminal charges. Prosecutors moved quickly. Roland Petrie and Fred "Skip" McKee were both charged with first-degree murder. At long last, Cheryl's case was moving toward the justice her family had waited years to see. But while the legal process moved forward, another person found herself facing a truth she had spent years trying to understand. Yvonne. Cheryl's daughter. The little girl who had lost her mother had grown into a young woman. And throughout those years, one question had followed her everywhere. Was her father really capable of murder? It was a question that haunted her. Because no matter what investigators believed, no matter what evidence existed, he was still her father. And deep inside, part of her wanted to believe there had been some terrible mistake. She wanted to believe there was another explanation. Something. Anything. But the confession destroyed whatever hope remained. The truth was far worse than she had imagined. Her mother hadn't been killed by a stranger. She hadn't been the victim of a random act of violence. She had been betrayed. The man responsible was someone she had once loved. Someone she trusted. Someone who had shared her home and fathered her children. And that betrayal reached even deeper. During the investigation, authorities uncovered something that shook Yvonne to her core. According to information gathered by detectives, Roland had allegedly discussed plans involving her as well. The possibility that her own father had once considered having her killed was almost impossible to comprehend. It wasn't simply grief. It wasn't simply anger. It was heartbreak. The kind of heartbreak words can barely describe. Because learning that your father murdered your mother is devastating enough. Learning that he may have wanted you dead too is something entirely different. Yvonne carried that pain into the courtroom. And when the day finally arrived for sentencing, she stood before the man who had changed her life forever. The room was silent. Everyone knew this moment would be emotional. But nobody could have prepared themselves for the strength she displayed. She faced her father. Not with fear. Not with hesitation. But with courage. And she asked the judge to give him the maximum sentence allowed by law. She described him as a dangerous man. A man who destroyed the lives of those closest to him. And for the first time, Roland Petrie couldn't escape. He couldn't leave. He couldn't interrupt. He couldn't manipulate anyone. He simply had to stand there and listen. Listen to the pain he had caused. Listen to the daughter whose childhood had been shattered. Listen to the woman whose mother had been stolen from her. For Yvonne, those words had been building inside her for years. And now, finally, she had the chance to say them. Not as a frightened little girl. But as a woman determined to make sure her mother's voice was heard. People inside the courtroom later remembered the emotion in her words. Not hatred. Not revenge. Pain. Deep, unimaginable pain. Because beneath every sentence was a daughter who had spent years trying to understand why. Why her mother? Why their family? Why destroy everything? But there were no answers that could ever make sense. No explanation could justify what happened. No amount of money could explain such cruelty. And perhaps that was the most terrifying part of all. Investigators had come to believe that greed had driven everything. Insurance money. Nothing more. A human life exchanged for financial gain. A mother. A daughter. A family. Destroyed. And all because one man believed money mattered more than the people who loved him. Eventually, Roland Petrie entered a guilty plea. His sentence was 40 years in prison. Given his age and circumstances, most believed he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The sentence brought relief to many. But relief is not the same as healing. Prison could punish him. But it could never give Cheryl back. It could never restore the years stolen from her children. It could never erase the nightmares. And it could never remove the pain. 7 months later, Fred McKee also admitted his role. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. For his part in Cheryl's death, he received a sentence of 20 years. Another chapter had finally closed. Yet for detectives who had worked the case, there remained a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because justice had finally been served. Sadness because it had taken 13 years. 13 years before Cheryl's voice was heard. 13 years before her family received answers. And 13 years during which those responsible had lived with their secret. Cold case investigators know something many people don't. Time doesn't always destroy cases. Sometimes time exposes them. Relationships change. Consciences weaken. People talk. Secrets become burdens. And eventually, the truth finds a way to surface. That's exactly what happened here. One phone call. One former cellmate. One decision to speak. And an entire murder conspiracy that had remained hidden for over a decade suddenly collapsed. Looking back, investigators realized something chilling. Roland Petrie had followed a pattern. This wasn't his first connection to murder. Years earlier, he had already been involved in another murder-for-hire case. And once again, money had become the driving force. It revealed something terrifying about the kind of man he was. Someone willing to manipulate others. Someone willing to lie without remorse. Someone who saw people as tools. Even the people closest to him. And perhaps nobody represented that tragedy more than Cheryl herself. Because despite everything, she had loved him. She had stood by him when others walked away. She had defended him. Believed in him. Fought for him. She had written letters. Petitioned for his release. Given him another chance. And in return, she paid with her life. Friends who knew Cheryl often remembered her kindness. Her loyalty. Her devotion to her children. And the love she gave to those around her. Many believed her greatest flaw was simply trusting too much. Believing people could change. Believing love was enough. But evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind familiar faces. Sometimes it speaks softly. Sometimes it pretends to care. And sometimes, by the time you recognize it, it's already too late. Today, Cheryl Petrie's story remains a reminder that cold cases are never truly over. As long as investigators continue searching. As long as evidence survives. As long as someone carries the weight of a secret. Justice remains possible. And perhaps that's why cold case detectives never stop believing. Because every file represents a life. Every photograph represents a person. Every unanswered question represents a family still waiting. And somewhere, someone knows the truth. In Cheryl's case, the truth stayed hidden for 13 years. But it couldn't stay hidden forever. Because lies eventually crack. Secrets eventually surface. And justice, no matter how delayed, has a way of finding those who think they've escaped it. Cheryl Petrie never got to watch her children grow older. She never got the chance to tell them goodbye. But after 13 years, her story was finally heard. And the men responsible were finally held accountable. If this story touched you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Cold Case 247 and share your thoughts in the comments below. Which part of this case shocked you the most? Because every victim deserves to be remembered. And every story deserves to be told. Until next time, stay safe. And remember, sometimes the truth takes years to arrive. But sooner or later, it always comes knocking.